On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi McKay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musi and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musi was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musi wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musi was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musi and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musi finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musi felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musi went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musi had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musi took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musi just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grabber. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, cataloged, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal, and this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So, he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So, Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident, In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20-mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was a cold afternoon in the winter of 2015, in 57 year. Old Patricia Duray was asleep on her couch inside her home in France. She had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, and she decided to spend it relaxing, just watching a movie. But at some point, she'd clearly drifted off. The sound that woke her was the familiar ding of her cell phone. Patricia slowly opened her eyes, feeling groggy and a bit disoriented. She blinked a few times, letting her living room come back into focus. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, the credits rolling. She must have been out for a while. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone to see who had messaged her. The screen lit up showing a new text, but it was from a number she didn't have saved in her contacts. She tapped on the notification, and the message that appeared on her screen was strange, to say the least. It read in French, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." For a moment, Patricia just stared at the words, completely baffled. It made no sense at all. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. She scrolled up, and that's when she saw there were other messages in the thread from this same number, messages she had received months ago. And in that instant, she remembered exactly who this was. The person sending these cryptic texts was a middle-aged woman named Bérengère. About 8 months before this, Bérengère had approached Patricia while she was out in public. She had seemed frantic, telling Patricia that she was in desperate need of her help. The reason, Bérengère had explained, was that she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. Now, for most people, this would be a very strange request to receive from a stranger. But for Patricia, it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. You see, in addition to being a well-respected local news reporter, Patricia Duray was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium. She genuinely believed she had the ability to communicate with the dead, and it was a part of her life she was very passionate about. In fact, she was quite famous for it throughout France. Because of her public profile, both as a journalist and as a medium, she attracted a lot of attention. People would often come to her with stories of paranormal activity. They'd claim their house was haunted, that they'd seen a ghost, or that strange things were happening that they couldn't explain. Patricia always tried to approach these situations with an open mind, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew that most of the time there was a perfectly logical explanation. More often than not, when she would follow up on these claims, she'd discover that the ghostly whispers were just drafty windows, the footsteps in the attic were the house settling, and the eerie shadow was just a trick of the light. There were rarely any actual spirits to communicate with. So, the vast majority of the time, when someone approached her with a story about a haunting, she took it with a grain of salt. When Berenger had first come to her 8 months ago, talking about a haunted castle, Patricia's internal reaction was basically, sure it is. She was polite, of course, but she didn't really believe it. Berenger, however, had been very persistent. She was clearly distressed and desperate for help. So, mostly just to be kind and to end the conversation, Patricia had given the woman her phone number. Almost immediately after, Berenger had sent her a couple of texts, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them, filing it away as just another likely dead end. But now, 8 months later, here was Berenger again, texting her with this bizarre and dramatic message about a castle calling for her. For some reason, this time, it was different. Maybe it was the strange wording of the text, or maybe it was just the fact that Patricia had a rare day off with nothing else to do. Whatever it was, her interest was piqued. She found herself feeling a strange sense of inspiration, a little pull of curiosity. She decided she would actually follow up on this one. She was going to go check out this castle and see for herself what this supposed haunting was all about. About an hour and a half later, Patricia's car pulled up in front of a small, charming cottage. The cottage was situated on the same large property as the castle. From her earlier brief text exchange with Berenger, she knew this was where the woman lived. Patricia parked her car, got out, and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knocked firmly, then waited. There was no answer. The air was still and quiet. After a few moments of silence, she knocked again, this time a little louder. A moment later, the door creaked open. But the person standing in the doorway was not Berenger. It was a middle-aged man, and he looked completely confused to see a stranger standing on his doorstep. The look on his face was one of pure bewilderment. Seeing his confusion, Patricia immediately launched into an explanation. She said, "Hello, I'm looking for Berenger. I'm Patricia." We were just speaking via text message. The man just continued to stare at her, his expression not changing. He seemed to have no idea what she was talking about. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment. But then, from behind the man, Berenger appeared. As soon as Berenger saw who was at the door, her entire demeanor changed. Her face flooded with relief, and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was about to start weeping with joy. She rushed forward, pushing past the man. "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. We really need your help." Before Patricia could even ask a question or get a word in, Berenger gestured towards the confused man who had opened the door. By now, his expression had softened a little, though he still looked a bit lost. "This is my husband, Remy," Berenger said. "And he is just as relieved as I am that you're here." At this, Patricia offered the man a polite smile and shook his hand. She turned back to them both and said, "Well, I don't know yet what I can do for you. Why don't you start from the beginning and fill me in? All I really know is that you believe the castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" Berenger took a moment to compose herself, wiping a tear from her eye. She took a deep breath and then began to explain. About a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the full-time caretaker for the historic castle on the property. As part of the job, they were given free housing in this very cottage. She had come along to help him with the upkeep. At first, she said, they were both thrilled. It was a wonderful opportunity, a beautiful place to live, and a steady job for Remy. But their excitement didn't last long. Berenger told Patricia that they had only been living and working there for a couple of weeks when the strange things started to happen. She explained that she would often be in the castle by herself, doing her daily chores like cleaning or dusting. She would know for a fact that she was the only person inside the huge, empty building. And yet, she would suddenly hear the clear and unmistakable sound of footsteps, people walking, and sometimes even running around on the floors above her. At this point in the story, Remy chimed in, speaking for the first time. He said, "Yes, I've heard it too. I've heard those same footsteps, and I know the castle is totally empty." He looked at Patricia with wide, earnest eyes. "But it's even stranger than that," he continued. He said he would be working inside the castle and he would hear voices. And he wasn't talking about faint whispers that you might hear in a movie. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs. The screams would come from distant, unseen parts of the castle, and he said it was absolutely terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Berenger tell their story, she was struck by how genuinely frightened they were. They weren't being dramatic or trying to sensationalize anything. It was clear that whatever they had experienced inside that castle had deeply shaken them. They seemed trapped. Remy's job required him to be there, to go inside the castle every day, but it was becoming an increasingly difficult and stressful ordeal for both of them. They felt like they had nowhere to turn and that no one would take them seriously. Patricia couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for them. They came across as honest, ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary and frightening situation. But at the same time, her professional skepticism was still there. She was a veteran in these matters. She had been on numerous house calls to supposedly haunted locations. She knew that screams could be the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in a window, and footsteps could be a raccoon in the attic or a pet walking around somewhere else in the house. There could easily be a rational explanation for everything they were describing. But their fear was so palpable, so real, that she knew it warranted a closer look. There was enough here to convince her that she needed to see the castle for herself. So, after they finished their story, she looked at them both and said, "Okay, let's go over there. Let's go see the castle." A few minutes later, Patricia was following Berenger and Remy along a wooded path that led from their cottage to the castle. Even from a distance, the castle was an imposing sight. It was huge and intimidating, with two very tall round towers on either end. In the middle was a slightly shorter section, decorated with a cluster of smaller turrets that reached up towards the gray sky. The front of the castle, the side they were approaching, only had two visible windows. For a fleeting second, as Patricia looked up at them, she had an uneasy feeling that the windows were like two giant eyes, and the castle itself was watching her approach. She quickly shook the feeling off, telling herself not to get carried away, and kept walking. A few moments later, they arrived at the castle's massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood. Remy pulled out a huge, old-fashioned key ring that was heavy with dozens of keys. He found the right one, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud metallic clank. Then he pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside, gesturing for Patricia to go inside first. Patricia took a steadying breath, trying her best to remain professional and objective. She was not going to buy into the hype just yet. This could still be something completely normal. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the castle, she found herself in an enormous, empty space known as the Great Hall. The first thing she noticed was how incredibly dark and cold it was inside. Of course, it was an old stone castle, so a certain level of cold was to be expected. But this felt different. It was an eerie, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air itself felt heavy, thick, with a kind of oppressive silence. It was not a welcoming place. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and leave immediately. Patricia took another deep breath, trying to center herself and focus on the task at hand. She looked around the great hall more closely. There were a few windows on the far wall, but their heavy wooden shutters were all closed tight, plunging the room into shadow. Directly in front of her was a grand, sweeping stone staircase that led up to the upper floors. To her right and to her left, she could see long, dark hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of other rooms. After a few moments of just taking it all in, Patricia turned to Berenger. She said, "Okay, so you mentioned you've heard footsteps upstairs when you knew this place was empty. Can you remember what you were doing on any of those occasions? What were you doing the last time you heard the sounds?" Berenger thought for a second and then nodded. "Actually, yes, I do remember," she said. "The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on those windows over there. And I know I heard people walking around upstairs while I was doing that." Instantly, Patricia's practical mind went to work. That could be it. Maybe the sound of the old heavy shutters moving was creating some kind of echo or vibration that in this cavernous space could be mistaken for footsteps. It was a plausible theory. "Okay," Patricia said, "let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if that could be causing the strange sounds you're hearing." Berenger and Remy didn't seem offended by her suggestion at all. In fact, they seemed eager to find a rational explanation for what was happening. They wanted it to be something simple. So, the three of them walked over to one of the large windows. Patricia reached out, grabbed the wooden handles of the shutters, and pulled them open. Then she pushed them closed. She did this a few more times, listening carefully. But there were no strange sounds. There was the creak of the old wood and the thud as they closed, but certainly nothing that could be confused with the sound of footsteps running around upstairs. It was a dead end. This was not the explanation. Still, just to be thorough, Patricia decided she would try one of the other shutters. Maybe one of them was faulty or made a different noise. She walked over to the next window and reached for the shutter. But before her hand even made contact with the wood, a loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed through the entire castle. It seemed to come from somewhere high above them on one of the upper floors. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the castle was plunged back into a deadly, unnerving silence. Immediately, the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. It was an unmistakable sound, a human-like shriek of terror or pain. She turned to look at Remy and Berenger. They were both frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had obviously heard things like this before, but it was clear that it was just as terrifying every single time. Patricia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, not sure what to do next. She forced herself to stay calm. Wait a minute, she told herself silently. That couldn't have been what it sounded like. There has to be a logical explanation. Part of the reason for her skepticism was that even in all her years as a psychic medium, she had never experienced anything so direct, so visceral. A ghostly scream was something you saw in movies, not something that happened in real life. So she turned to the terrified couple and said in a calm voice, "Look, I obviously heard that too. But let's not rule out that it could have been the wind or something else. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic. Let's just search the castle and see what we're dealing with." Remy and Berenger did not look reassured in the slightest, but they nodded meekly, willing to follow her lead. But before anyone could move, before anyone could even take a step, it happened again. Another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence, this time from a different location upstairs. It sounded like a different voice. And then, once again, it was gone, leaving only a ringing in their ears and a thick, heavy silence. At that moment, it became very clear to Patricia and certainly to the couple that this was not the wind. The castle might just be haunted after all. There was something very wrong happening here. As Patricia stood there, trying to process what was happening and figure out what their next move should be, because she was now, by default, the expert in charge, a powerful and strange feeling came over her. She would later describe it as a pull, like a magnet was inside her, pulling her in the direction of where the screams had come from. She felt an overwhelming and undeniable urge to go upstairs to the second floor to find the source of those sounds. She felt like she had to. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a compulsion. She wasn't even sure if it was her own psychic abilities kicking in, or if it was the castle itself drawing her deeper into its shadows. Without saying a word to Remy and Berenger, without even a glance in their direction, Patricia silently turned and began to walk, almost as if against her will, towards the huge stone staircase that led to the upper levels. The castle was now completely silent again. The only sound was the soft echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor as they moved towards the stairs. Remy and Berenger, their faces masks of terror, huddled closely behind Patricia, following her lead, not knowing what else to do. Up the stairs they went. Patricia was still in the grip of that intense feeling, that pull that she couldn't control. Up and up the stone steps she climbed, with the frightened couple close behind. No one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their shoes on the stone. They went all the way up to the third floor, which is where she felt the screams had most likely originated. At the top of the stairs, Patricia, acting almost on instinct, turned to her left and started walking down a long, dark hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors on either side. Again, the castle was unnervingly quiet. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Down the long hallway they walked, all the way to a dead end. And at the very end of the hallway, there was a single closed door. At this point, Patricia, almost as if she were a different person, turned and spoke to Remy in a sharp, almost aggressive tone. "Get your keys out," she commanded. "Open this door." She didn't even know why she was being so forceful. The words just came out of her. Berenger, however, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The owner of the castle," she whispered, "they told us this is the one room we are not allowed to go in. We've never been inside. We can't go in there." Patricia just looked at her, her expression unyielding. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." Berenger looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Remy just gave a slight shrug. They were in way over their heads and had no idea what to do. They figured they had to trust Patricia. She was the expert after all. So Remy pulled out his big ring of keys again. He fumbled through them, his hands shaking slightly, trying to find the right one. Patricia stood there, practically vibrating with the need to get into that room. She couldn't understand the feeling, but it was all-consuming. Finally, Remy found the key. He reached out, put it in the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open, and Patricia immediately walked inside. As the door swung open, Remy and Berenger got their first look inside the forbidden room. And it was completely unremarkable. It was just a vacant, empty room. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing at all. There was no obvious reason why this specific room would be off-limits. But as they stood in the doorway and watched Patricia walk slowly and methodically to the center of the room, they could have sworn they heard the faint sound of whispers suddenly starting up inside the empty space. Patricia came to a stop in the very middle of the room, her back facing them. And then things got even stranger. Patricia, who was now acting very differently from the calm professional who had first arrived, just stood there, rigid, staring towards the back wall of the dark room as the whispers seemed to grow louder. From their vantage point in the doorway, Berenger and Remy watched in horror as Patricia's body began to twitch. Her shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and her neck snapped to the side at a strange angle. And then she began to let out a horrible, croaking sound. It was a constant, single-tone, guttural noise. It went on and on for so long that it seemed impossible. She should have needed to take a breath to continue, but she didn't. The sound just emanated from her, relentless and unsettling. Remy and Berenger were now terrified, not of the castle, but of Patricia. As she was twitching and croaking, she suddenly stopped, whipped around, and faced them. Her mouth was hanging open, her jaw completely slack, and that awful croaking sound was still coming out of her. But they could also see that she was weeping. Tears were streaming down her face. Remy and Berenger were beyond terrified, but they could also see that Patricia was in some kind of crisis, and they wanted to help. They were just about to ask her what was wrong, what they could do, when a loud slamming sound echoed up from one of the lower floors. It sounded like a heavy door had been slammed shut with incredible force. The noise seemed to snap Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. Her expression changed in an instant. She became focused, alert. And then, without a word to the couple, she bolted right past them, sprinted out of the room, and ran down the hallway and down the stairs. She was chasing after the sound. Remy and Berenger looked at each other, stunned. What else could they do but follow her? So they ran down the hallway, several paces behind Patricia, who was already somewhere on a lower floor. They got down to the second floor and could hear movement coming from one of the rooms down the hall. Then they heard a loud, almost animalistic yelling sound. It seemed to be Patricia, yelling or growling or something from inside one of the rooms. They cautiously made their way in that direction and saw an open door that led into a bedroom. Off of the bedroom was a small bathroom. They went into the bedroom and looked into the bathroom. And there was Patricia. Her back was to them, and she was on her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She was looking up at something in the room, something they couldn't see. They could see her face from an angle, and it was contorted in pure horror. She was looking at something that was terrifying her, but to them, the bathroom was completely empty. Remy and Berenger didn't hesitate. They rushed into the bathroom and grabbed Patricia. She seemed to resist, not wanting to leave, but they were stronger. They dragged her out of the bathroom, pulled her to her feet, and literally, forcibly, removed her from the castle out into the fresh air. Several hours later, Berenger and Remy were back inside their cozy cottage. They were sitting in their living room, with stacks of old papers and historical documents scattered all over their coffee table. Sitting with them was Patricia. By this point, she was mostly back to her normal self, but she was still visibly shaken by what had happened inside the castle. She was now able to explain to the couple what she had experienced from her perspective. She told them that she had, in fact, gone into a kind of trance, a psychic medium experience unlike any she had ever had before. This was on a completely different level. It was visceral and terrifyingly real. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked, forbidden room on the third floor, the room was not empty for her. When she was pulled in there, what she saw was a room filled with people, entities, or ghosts. Berenger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. She said they were all wearing different kinds of clothes, from different time periods. There were people dressed in medieval peasant outfits, women in Victorian dresses, and men in 20th century business suits. But the most powerful impression she got was not their appearance, but their emotional state. She could feel how lost and scared these spirits were. They seemed to be in trouble. Patricia said she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then anchored there, unable to move. As she stood there, these ghosts began to crowd in on her, getting closer and closer, as if they were desperately trying to get her help. She felt overcome by a suffocating, claustrophobic feeling. It wasn't their physical presence that was overwhelming her, it was their sadness. Their collective loneliness and desperation washed over her in waves, and it was so powerful and so awful that it made her weep uncontrollably. Eventually, she said, she was able to force her body to turn around and at least look towards the exit. That's when she heard the loud slamming door from downstairs. The sudden noise seemed to startle the spirits, and they backed away from her, which gave her the chance to bolt from the room. Patricia then explained that when she ran out and started heading in the direction of the slammed door, the feeling of being pulled was very different. The pull that had led her up to the third floor had felt neutral, maybe even positive, like something was guiding her to help. But this new pull, leading her down to the second floor, felt totally different. It was dark. She knew that something evil was pulling her towards it. But still, almost against her own will, she ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and into that bedroom, with Berenger and Remy following behind. When she went into the bathroom, she saw something so terrifying that she just collapsed to her knees and began to scream. That was the animalistic wailing that the couple had heard. What she saw was an enormous, tall, Guzek figure. It was the ghost of a man, covered in deep scars, wearing rusted chainmail armor, like a knight from a long-forgotten time. She said he radiated pure evil. It was a dark, malevolent presence. She knew that was the source of the dark feeling that had pulled her there. She felt like it was trying to pull her to her death, and she believes that it was only because Remy and Berenger came in and physically pulled her away that she was able to escape. After Patricia finished her incredible story, the three of them sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had to figure out what it all meant. They quickly decided to focus on the most immediate threat, the evil entity, the tall man in the rusted armor. Who was he? And what did he want? Berenger and Remy had already gathered up a bunch of historical documents about the castle, and they had spread them out on the coffee table. Together, they started going through them, looking for any clue that might explain who this terrifying spirit could be. As they were looking through the old papers, one particular section caught Patricia's eye. She felt a strange pull towards it, a feeling that she needed to read it. It was a section about a knight named Jean who had lived in the 14th century. The document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between England and France. During that war, the castle had been used as a French military fortress, and Jean, the knight, had been killed in a battle that took place right there at the castle. After Patricia read this out loud, she told Berenger and Remy that she just had a feeling. She couldn't explain why, but she was certain that the evil spirit she had seen in the bathroom, the tall man in the armor, was the ghost of Jean. However, even if she was right, it didn't solve their problem. They still didn't know why he was there, why he had appeared to her, or why any of this was happening, and who were all the other ghosts in the room on the third floor. None of it made any more sense. Berenger eventually looked at Patricia and asked, "What do you think all this means? What do we do?" But Patricia was still deeply shaken. She was a renowned psychic, but she had never experienced anything this intense. It was truly terrifying. She just shook her head and said, "Look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about all of this. I need to process what happened here." Remy and Berenger were obviously disappointed, and probably terrified at the thought of being left alone with the haunted castle, but they understood. They couldn't force her to stay. So, Patricia got up and left, leaving them alone with their fear. After she was gone, Berenger and Remy made a pact. They agreed that even though it was Remy's job to look after the castle, it was just too dangerous to go inside for now. They would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could figure out what to do. For the next couple of days, life was surprisingly normal for them. As long as they stayed away from the castle, nothing strange happened at all. They just lived in their cottage and tried to go about their lives. But Patricia didn't call, and she didn't come back. She was at her own home, trying to come to terms with her terrifying experience. And during this time, Berenger started to feel a strange sensation in her chest. It was a feeling of needing to go to the castle. It was a pull, very similar to what Patricia had described. She tried to ignore it, to fight it, but the feeling just grew stronger. She felt this undeniable compulsion to go over there. Then one day, Remy was looking out the window of their cottage, and he saw his wife, Berenger, walking purposefully across the lawn, straight towards the front door of the castle. He knew immediately what was happening. He thought there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed. He ran out of the cottage, raced over to her, and literally grabbed her and pulled her back just moments before she could go inside. When he pulled her away, she seemed to snap out of it, and she couldn't even explain why she was there. She just said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come over here." But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened in those few days. Shortly after that incident, a random man had wandered onto the castle grounds. He didn't seem to know why he was there, but he too was being drawn towards the castle. As this man was walking towards the front door, a deer, which also seemed to be drawn to the castle, came running out of the woods and rammed into the man with incredible force. He was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized, and he actually lost an eye in the incident. After this happened, Berenger and Remy knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had been trying to give Patricia her space, but things were escalating. The dark energy in the castle seemed to be getting stronger, its influence spreading. They had to get in touch with her. Berenger called Patricia and told her everything that had happened. She said, "Whatever's going on in that castle, whatever dark energy is in there, it's getting stronger." At first, Patricia was not eager to return. She had made a conscious decision to stay away. The experience had terrified her, and she didn't want any part of it. But as she listened to Berenger on the phone, she could hear the sheer desperation in her voice. Berenger and Remy were at their wits' end. They were lost, and they were turning to her not just as a psychic, but as a friend. They needed her help. So, reluctantly, Patricia agreed to go back. The following evening, the three of them were back inside the castle. They were standing in the second-floor bathroom, the very same room where Patricia had encountered the terrifying entity she now believed was the ghost of Jean. Patricia had come back to attempt an exorcism. She stood in the middle of the small bathroom, while Berenger and Remy huddled together behind her near the doorway. Berenger was so scared she was physically shaking. They watched as Patricia, despite her own fear, stood there calmly with her eyes closed. She was trying to channel the energy in the room to connect with the spirit of John. After a few moments of silent concentration, Patricia seemed to connect with something that Berenger and Remy couldn't see. The room was empty to them, but it was clear that Patricia had found what she was looking for. Then, out of nowhere, her voice boomed through the small bathroom, loud and stern. "Jean, show yourself." Berenger and Remy stared at her, their hearts pounding. Patricia opened her eyes and looked around the room, and then her gaze locked onto something on the other side of the bathroom. She could clearly see something that they couldn't. Patricia, her eyes still fixed on whatever was in the room with them, spoke again in that same loud, commanding voice. "It's over," she said. "You have to move on." She was speaking directly to the entity, to Jean, telling him that his time was up. For a long moment, there was just silence. Berenger and Remy held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Was Patricia going to go into another trance? But she remained calm, forceful, and anchored to the spot. Nothing happened. It was completely silent. Then Patricia repeated her command, her voice even stronger this time. "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after she spoke, they all heard it. The sound of banging on a door coming from the third floor directly above them. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, dozens of them, all over the place. And then the sound of mournful crying. There was more banging. Berenger and Remy clutched each other, terrified. But Patricia remained unmoved, a rock in the center of the storm. And then, suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of a door flying open upstairs. This was followed by the sound of all those footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed with the sound of crying. But the crying had changed. It was no longer sad. It sounded like blissful crying, like tears of pure joy, as a crowd of spirits charged down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the castle forever. And then, just like that, it was over. A profound calm fell over the entire castle. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. Patricia turned away from whatever she had been looking at in the bathroom and faced Remy and Berenger. She was smiling. "It's over," she said softly. "It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia later explained to them what had happened. She had been able to channel the ghost of Jean. He had been haunting the castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a kind of purgatory, believing he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. For centuries, every time someone died in or around the castle, he would take their spirit and hold it prisoner in that locked room on the third floor. But when Patricia had told him it's over, he understood that she meant the war was over. And at that moment, Jean himself was the one who freed all the prisoners. That was the sound they heard, all the spirits being released, joyful and free at last. And then Jean's own spirit was finally able to find peace and move on. But there is one final strange twist to this story. A short time after the exorcism, when life had returned to normal for everyone, Patricia and Berenger were talking on the phone. At one point in the conversation, Patricia said offhandedly, "You know, Berenger, it's a good thing you texted me again and got me to come back out there. Clearly, I was able to help." "What a good thing it was that you texted me." And Berenger replied, "What do you mean?" Patricia said, "You know, when you texted me that the castle was calling me." "You were right." "It was, and I came over and we took care of it." But Berenger was confused. She said, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send you that message." Patricia, surprised, pulled out her phone and found the text. She read it back to Berenger. "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Berenger insisted, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Berenger, and Remy still have no idea who or what sent that fateful text message to Patricia's phone. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.